Sometimes a dog does not stop because he is afraid. Sometimes he stops because he knows something the rest of us have forgotten. The wind came hard off the Pacific that morning, carrying the scent of salt, pine, and old rain as it swept across the narrow cliff trail above the Oregon coastline. Eleanor Whitaker tightened her grip on the worn hiking stick in her hand and carefully placed one boot in front of the other. At 70 years old, every step uphill demanded a conversation between determination and aching joints, but she had never been the kind of woman who turned back simply because the road grew difficult. Beside her walked Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat that shimmered in the pale sunlight whenever the clouds parted. His amber eyes moved constantly, studying the trail, the trees, the distant horizon. Though his muzzle carried a few strands of silver now, there was nothing old about the way he moved. He climbed with the quiet confidence of a dog who trusted his instincts more than the world around him. The cabin appeared just after noon. Perched alone on a rocky ledge nearly 200 feet above the crashing ocean below, it looked less like a home and more like a memory someone had forgotten to erase. Weather-beaten boards clung stubbornly to the frame. The windows were clouded with dust and age. Moss crawled across the roof like a slow-moving tide. Eleanor stopped for a moment to catch her breath. The sight of the place stirred something deep inside her chest. She had not seen the cabin in more than 30 years. Time had stolen its color, but not its presence. It remained exactly where she remembered, standing watch over the sea like a silent witness. Ranger continued ahead for several yards before suddenly freezing. Eleanor noticed it immediately. 1 second he was moving. The next he stood perfectly still. Not a single muscle shifted beneath his coat. His ears rose. His tail lowered. His gaze locked on the cabin. Eleanor frowned. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. Ranger did not respond. He did not look at her. He did not move toward the cabin either. He simply stared. The wind hissed through the nearby pines. Far below, waves rolled against the rocks in slow, rhythmic thunder. Eleanor felt a faint chill brush across the back of her neck despite the mild temperature. Ranger had hiked hundreds of trails with her over the years. He had encountered deer, bears, storms, and strangers. Never once had he reacted like this. She stepped closer and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The dog remained rigid. His breathing slowed. His eyes narrowed slightly as if trying to focus on something hidden beyond the faded walls. Then a low sound escaped him. Not a growl. Not fear. More like recognition. Eleanor followed his line of sight toward the dark front porch. The cabin seemed empty. Lifeless. Abandoned. Yet for reasons she could not explain, she suddenly felt as though someone had been waiting there for a very long time. The clouds drifted across the sun, casting a gray shadow over the cliff. Ranger took one careful step backward, then another. For the first time that day, Eleanor's confidence wavered. Because whatever had stopped her dog cold was standing somewhere beyond that front door, and deep inside her heart, a quiet voice whispered that their journey to this forgotten cabin was never really about the cabin at all. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Eleanor kept her hand resting on Ranger's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing beneath the thick fur. The old cabin stood silent against the gray sky, and yet memories were already beginning to wake inside her. She had first come here at 29 years old, when life still felt endless and every promise seemed capable of surviving time. Back then, the cabin had belonged to her husband, Thomas Whitaker, a former Marine whose quiet strength had been the anchor of her world. He loved remote places. He loved the ocean. Most of all, he loved this lonely stretch of coastline where the wind never stopped speaking. Eleanor could still picture him standing on the porch with a coffee mug in his hand, watching gulls drift over the waves below. His laugh had always carried farther than the sea breeze. 32 years had passed since she last heard it. The thought tightened something deep inside her chest. After Thomas disappeared during a powerful coastal storm, people offered explanations. Some were kind, others were not. Eventually, the town moved on. Stories faded. Faces changed. But Eleanor never stopped wondering. She never stopped carrying the unanswered questions. That was why she had returned. Not because she expected answers. At 70 years old, she had learned that life rarely provided those. She had only wanted to see the cabin one last time before age made the climb impossible. Yet standing there now, she no longer believed this trip was about nostalgia. Ranger suddenly lifted his nose into the wind. His ears twitched. The dog turned slightly toward the porch steps. Then he released a soft whine. Eleanor had heard that sound before. It was the sound he made when sensing someone nearby, someone he trusted. Her eyes drifted toward the weathered structure again. The front door hung slightly open, moving almost imperceptibly with each gust. A narrow gap revealed only darkness beyond. The scent of old cedar floated from inside. Beneath it lingered something else. Something metallic and faint, hidden beneath decades of dust. Ranger took 3 cautious steps forward before stopping once more. His gaze shifted toward a window on the second floor. Eleanor followed it instinctively. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement behind the cloudy glass. Just a shadow. A trick of light. Nothing more. Yet her pulse quickened. The clouds overhead thickened, dimming the afternoon sun. Far below, the ocean changed color from blue to steel gray. The entire coastline seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small photograph she had carried for years. The edges were worn soft from time. In it, Thomas stood beside the cabin, smiling, one arm resting on a younger German shepherd named Scout. She looked from the picture to Ranger. The resemblance was remarkable. Same intelligent eyes, same alert posture, almost as though loyalty itself had passed from one generation to the next. A sudden gust swept across the cliff and tugged at the photograph. Eleanor nearly dropped it. Ranger reacted instantly, catching the paper against his paw before it could blow away. She smiled faintly and bent to retrieve it. But when she looked up again, the dog was staring at something near the porch floorboards. Completely focused. Completely still. And for the second time that day, Eleanor felt the unmistakable sensation that someone was trying to lead them toward a truth that had been waiting decades to be found. The old porch groaned softly beneath Eleanor's boots as she stepped closer. Ranger moved beside her now, not reluctantly, but with the focused caution of a dog following a scent buried beneath layers of time. The weathered boards were silver from decades of salt air. Small patches of moss clung to the edges where rainwater collected. Somewhere inside the cabin, a loose shutter tapped rhythmically against the wall. The sound echoed through the silence like a distant clock. Eleanor paused at the bottom step and looked out across the ocean. The view was exactly as she remembered. Endless gray water stretched toward the horizon where sea and sky blurred together. Thomas used to stand here for hours, watching storms gather offshore. He always claimed the ocean spoke differently before bad weather arrived. Back then she had laughed at the idea. Now she was not so sure. Ranger suddenly lowered his head toward the porch floor. His nose traced a narrow path between 2 warped planks. He inhaled deeply, then pawed once at the wood. Eleanor watched carefully. The dog repeated the motion. Not frantic, deliberate, almost patient, as if he wanted her to notice something rather than uncover it himself. She crouched slowly, her knees protesting from the climb. Between the cracks, she saw nothing at first except darkness. Then a faint glimmer caught her eye. Sunlight briefly escaped the clouds and slipped through the gap. Something metallic reflected the light. Her heartbeat quickened. Eleanor brushed away years of accumulated dirt and pine needles. Beneath them lay the corner of a small object lodged tightly between the boards. She reached carefully into the narrow opening. Her fingertips touched cold metal. The object resisted at first, trapped by time and moisture, but eventually came free. Eleanor stared at it in silence. It was a military dog tag, tarnished, worn, partially covered by corrosion. The chain was broken. Several letters remained visible while others had been erased by decades of weather. Her breath caught in her throat. The surname was still readable. Whitaker. For a moment the world seemed to tilt beneath her. The wind disappeared. The crashing waves below faded into the distance. All she could see was the small piece of metal resting in her palm. Thomas had worn dog tags every day, even after leaving military service. He used to joke that Marines never really stopped being Marines. Ranger sat quietly beside her. His amber eyes never left her face. Eleanor turned the tag over. The backside carried faint scratches she recognized immediately. Thomas had once carved a tiny cross near the edge with a pocket knife during a camping trip. She remembered teasing him for ruining government property. He had laughed and said faith was worth the paperwork. Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes before she even realized it. Not because she had found the tag, because of where she had found it. Thomas had not visited this cabin occasionally. He had been here. Somehow, at some point, after the night everyone believed he vanished forever. A sudden sound interrupted her thoughts. A low creak echoed from inside the cabin. Ranger's ears rose instantly. The dog stood and fixed his gaze toward the open doorway. Eleanor followed his stare. The darkness beyond the threshold seemed deeper now. Waiting, watching, holding secrets that had survived longer than anyone expected. And for the first time since beginning the climb, Eleanor felt certain that the answers she had searched for all these years were no longer hidden very far away. The doorway seemed darker than it should have been. Eleanor slipped the dog tag carefully into her jacket pocket and rose to her feet. Ranger remained beside her, alert but calm now, as though finding the tag had confirmed something he already sensed. The old German shepherd stepped onto the porch and paused at the threshold. His nose lifted. The scent of aged cedar drifted outward along with traces of dust and damp wood. Eleanor followed slowly. Every board beneath her boots answered with a soft creak. The sound echoed through the empty structure. Inside, the cabin felt frozen in another decade. A stone fireplace stood against the far wall, its surface covered in a thin veil of gray ash and cobwebs. A wooden table leaned slightly to one side. 2 chairs remained where someone had left them long ago. Dust floated through narrow shafts of light that slipped between the curtains. For a moment, Eleanor simply stood there, absorbing the weight of memory. She remembered winter evenings beside that fireplace. She remembered Thomas reading aloud while rain tapped against the windows. She remembered believing that ordinary days would last forever. Ranger moved ahead carefully, crossing the room toward the back wall. His nails clicked softly against the floorboards. Then he stopped beside the old table and lowered his head. Eleanor approached. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed faint marks carved into the tabletop. Time had nearly erased them, but not completely. She brushed away dust with her sleeve. The letters emerged slowly. T.W. Thomas Whitaker. Beneath the initials was a date. Her breath caught. The date was from 3 weeks after the storm that everyone believed had taken him away. Eleanor stared at the carving. Her mind struggled to accept what her eyes clearly saw. Thomas had been here after the storm. He had survived long enough to return to the cabin. The realization left her both hopeful and unsettled. Why had nobody known? Why had he never come home? Ranger released a low whine and shifted toward the far corner of the room. There, partially hidden behind an old bookshelf, sat a narrow cabinet built into the wall. Eleanor barely remembered it. Thomas used to store fishing gear there. The cabinet door stood slightly open. Ranger nudged it gently with his nose. The hinges groaned. Inside were only a few forgotten items. A lantern, several weathered maps, an empty coffee tin, yet something rested behind them. A folded envelope yellowed with age. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for it. The paper felt fragile. Dust clung to the edges. Across the front, written in familiar handwriting, were 3 words that immediately brought tears to her eyes. For Eleanor. She sank slowly into one of the chairs. The room seemed impossibly quiet. Even the ocean felt distant now. Ranger lay down beside her feet and rested his head against her boot. The envelope had waited here through storms, winters, and decades of silence. Somehow it had survived when so many other things had not. Eleanor carefully broke the brittle seal. As the folded pages inside slid into her hands, a sudden gust rattled the windows and swept through the cabin like a long-forgotten breath. And for the first time in 32 years, she was about to hear Thomas speak again. The paper trembled slightly in Eleanor's hands, though she could not tell whether it was from the ocean breeze slipping through the cracks or from her own unsteady fingers. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas had always written in careful block letters, neat and deliberate, the same way he approached nearly everything in life. She swallowed hard and began to read. My dearest Eleanor, if you are holding this letter, then time has carried us farther apart than either of us ever wanted. I pray it has also carried you safely through the years. Eleanor stopped for a moment and closed her eyes. Hearing his voice inside her mind felt almost unreal. Ranger remained pressed against her feet, silent and watchful. Outside, gulls drifted on the wind beyond the windows. She continued reading. Thomas wrote that the storm had forced him toward the cliffs on a night when visibility disappeared beneath rain and fog. He explained that he had eventually found shelter at the cabin after becoming stranded. Several pages described long days spent waiting for weather to clear. Yet something else caught Eleanor's attention. Near the middle of the letter, the tone changed. Thomas mentioned discovering something hidden beneath the cabin. He never fully explained what it was. Instead, he described it as a truth that belonged to another family, a secret he was trying to protect until the proper authorities could be contacted. Eleanor frowned. The words felt incomplete, almost as if he had intentionally left details out. Then she reached the final page. The ending was brief. If I cannot bring this story home myself, follow the signs. Trust the dog. The last sentence made her heart skip. Trust the dog. Thomas had written those words more than 3 decades before Ranger had even been born. Yet somehow the message felt directed at this very moment. Eleanor lowered the pages and stared across the room. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears pointed toward the front of the cabin. A distant sound drifted through the wind outside. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Approaching from the trail. Eleanor folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. Ranger stood immediately. His posture remained calm, but alert. Moments later, a figure appeared outside the dusty front window. A tall man wearing a dark green Park Service jacket paused on the porch and glanced through the glass. He looked to be in his late 30s, broad-shouldered with short brown hair and a neatly trimmed beard. A radio clipped to his belt crackled softly. When he noticed Eleanor inside, relief crossed his face. He stepped to the doorway and removed his cap respectfully. "Ma'am, I am glad I found you. The trail station said someone had signed in this morning and headed toward the cliff cabin. Most people avoid this place." Eleanor offered a faint smile. "I suppose I am not most people anymore." The man nodded. "Fair enough. My name is Caleb Monroe, former Marine. These days I help with search and rescue operations along the coast." Ranger approached him slowly and sniffed his hand. Caleb smiled immediately. "Good dog. Very good dog." Then his eyes drifted toward the letter partially visible in Eleanor's pocket and the old dog tag resting on the table. The smile faded. His expression turned thoughtful. "I know this sounds strange," he said quietly, "but that name on the tag. Whitaker. I have seen it before." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. The room suddenly seemed smaller. The ocean wind rattled the windows once more. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, hidden below decades of silence, a faint hollow sound echoed through the cabin. Caleb knelt beside the spot where the sound had come from and pressed his palm gently against the floorboards. The hollow echo answered again, faint but unmistakable. Ranger moved closer immediately. His nose touched a narrow seam running between 2 planks near the fireplace. The dog pawed once, then looked up at Eleanor as if waiting for permission. Caleb glanced toward her. "I think your dog is trying to show us something." Eleanor nodded slowly. Her heart had been racing ever since Caleb mentioned recognizing Thomas's name. The former Marine removed a multi-tool from his pocket and carefully worked the edge beneath one of the loose boards. The old would resist it at first. Decades of damp ocean air had fused everything together. Finally, with a soft crack, the plank lifted. Dust swirled upward through a shaft of gray afternoon light. Beneath the floor was a narrow compartment no more than 3 feet deep. Eleanor leaned forward. Inside rested a small metal box coated with rust, but otherwise intact. Ranger sat immediately, the same way trained dogs sat when they located something important. Caleb smiled faintly. "Good boy." Together they lifted the box onto the table. The latch had deteriorated long ago, allowing it to open with only gentle pressure. Inside lay several carefully wrapped bundles protected by oilcloth. There were photographs, documents, a leather notebook. Everything preserved far better than anyone could have expected. Eleanor picked up the first photograph. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Thomas stood beside a younger version of himself near the harbor 30 years earlier. Next to him was another man she did not recognize. On the back someone had written, "Friendship is a gift. Protect it." The notebook drew Caleb's attention. He opened it carefully. Page after page contained observations written in Thomas's handwriting. Dates, locations, weather notes, personal reflections. Then several entries described finding a hidden cache of family records inside the cliffside beneath the cabin. According to the journal, a local family had lost ownership of valuable coastal land generations earlier because critical legal papers disappeared. Thomas had discovered evidence proving the documents still existed. He had planned to deliver everything to the proper authorities once the weather improved. Eleanor listened silently as Caleb read portions aloud. None of it involved riches or treasure. It was something far more meaningful. It was the restoration of truth, the chance to return a family's history to them after decades of confusion and loss. That sounds exactly like Thomas, Eleanor whispered. He could never walk away from something if he thought it was the right thing to do. Caleb nodded. Neither could most Marines I have known. Ranger suddenly rose to his feet. His ears pointed toward the windows. Outside, the sky had darkened noticeably. Thick clouds rolled inland from the ocean, turning the horizon nearly black. Wind pressed against the cabin walls with growing force. The structure groaned softly in response. Caleb looked outside and frowned. Storm moving in faster than expected. Another gust rattled the glass. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in only moments. Eleanor carefully gathered the photographs and notebook. Despite the approaching weather, a strange peace had begun settling inside her. For the first time in decades, Thomas no longer felt lost. He felt near, present, almost as though every step of this journey had been guiding her toward this room, this box, this moment. Then Ranger walked toward the front door and stopped, completely still, his gaze fixed not on the storm, not on the trail, but somewhere farther down the cliff beyond the cabin itself. And the expression in his eyes told Eleanor that the most important discovery had not yet been made. The wind struck the cabin with renewed force, rattling the loose shutters and sending a faint whistle through the cracks in the walls. Caleb moved toward the doorway and followed Ranger's line of sight. The German shepherd stood motionless, every muscle focused on a narrow path that curved around the far side of the cliff. It was a route barely visible beneath decades of overgrown brush and wind-twisted grass. "Do you see that?" Caleb asked quietly. Eleanor nodded. She did not know what she saw exactly, only that Ranger had become absolutely certain about something. The dog took a few careful steps forward, then stopped and looked back at them, waiting, the same way he had waited beside the porch floorboards, the same way he had waited beside the hidden compartment. Caleb glanced toward the darkening sky. "We should probably head down before the storm gets worse." Ranger released a soft whine. Eleanor looked at the dog, then at the letter in her pocket. "Trust the dog." The words echoed through her mind. 32 years ago Thomas had written them. Somehow they felt less like advice and more like a final request. "We follow him," Eleanor said softly. Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but we stay careful." They secured the notebook, photographs, and documents inside Caleb's weatherproof pack. Moments later, the three of them stepped into the growing wind. Ranger led the way along the narrow trail. The path wrapped around the cliffside, hidden from view of anyone approaching the cabin. Pine branches bent overhead. The scent of rain grew stronger with every passing minute. Eleanor's knees ached from the climb, but she kept moving. Something inside her told her she had come too far to stop now. After nearly 200 yards, Ranger slowed. The terrain became rocky. Thick moss covered much of the ground. Small wildflowers clung stubbornly to cracks in the stone despite the harsh coastal conditions. Then the dog stopped again. Directly ahead stood a massive cedar tree. It must have been several centuries old. Its trunk measured nearly 12 feet across. Lightning scars marked one side, but the tree remained alive, towering over everything around it. Ranger approached the roots and began sniffing carefully. Caleb crouched beside him. "There is something here." Eleanor stepped closer. At first she noticed nothing unusual. Then she saw a small metal object partially hidden beneath roots and fallen needles. Caleb carefully brushed away the debris. A rusted military compass appeared. Eleanor immediately recognized it. Thomas carried that compass everywhere. He once joked that a Marine trusted his compass more than his own sense of direction. Her eyes filled with tears. That was his. Caleb examined the area more closely. Nearby, nearly concealed by years of growth, stood a weathered wooden marker no taller than 2 feet. Time had stripped away most of the writing. Only a few letters remained visible. Caleb gently cleared away moss from the surface. Eleanor held her breath. Beneath the moss was a simple inscription carved by hand. Not a grave marker, not a memorial, just a message. "If you found this, keep going." Eleanor stared at the words. The handwriting was Thomas's. There was no doubt. Ranger suddenly moved away from the cedar and climbed several yards higher along the rocks. The dog stopped beside a narrow opening hidden behind thick brush. Caleb pulled back the branches. Beyond them lay a small natural alcove sheltered beneath the cliff. Protected from wind. Protected from rain. Protected from time. Inside, something rested against the stone wall beneath a faded canvas covering. The storm clouds rolled overhead. Thunder murmured somewhere far out over the ocean. Yet none of them moved, because all three understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. Whatever waited inside that hidden alcove was the final piece of the story Thomas Whitaker had left behind. Caleb was the first to step into the alcove. The canvas covering had faded to a pale gray, its edges stiff from decades of salt air and moisture. Ranger remained at the entrance, watching silently. Eleanor could hear the distant roll of thunder beyond the cliff, but it felt far away now, as though the world itself had stepped back to allow this moment to unfold. Caleb carefully lifted one corner of the canvas. Beneath it rested a weatherproof storage chest secured with brass fittings darkened by age. The lid carried a small engraved plate. Eleanor's breath caught the instant she saw the name. Thomas Whitaker. For several seconds nobody spoke. The years seemed to collapse inward until only silence remained. Caleb slowly opened the chest. Inside were several neatly arranged items protected by layers of oilcloth. There was a folded American flag, a journal thicker than the one found in the cabin, a bundle of letters tied together with faded cord, and resting on top of everything else was a simple gold wedding ring attached to a small chain. Eleanor reached for it with trembling fingers. The moment she touched it, tears filled her eyes. She knew every scratch, every tiny imperfection. Thomas had worn that ring every day of their marriage. She pressed it gently against her heart. Ranger lowered his head as though he understood exactly what it meant. Caleb opened the larger journal. The pages revealed the final chapters of Thomas's story. After finding the missing family records, he had realized their historical importance. Severe weather had isolated the area for weeks, damaging roads and cutting communication lines along parts of the coast. Unable to leave immediately, he had protected the documents while waiting for help to arrive. The journal described his determination not to let the truth disappear again. It described long nights in the cabin, prayers beside the fireplace, and memories of Eleanor that filled every page. Then Caleb reached the final entry. His voice softened as he read aloud. If these words ever find their way home, tell Eleanor that every day apart from her remained a day I carried her with me. Tell her I never stopped trying to come back. Tell her that love is stronger than distance and kinder than time. Eleanor closed her eyes. The wind outside seemed gentler now, not because the storm had vanished, but because something inside her had finally settled. For more than 3 decades, she had carried questions heavy enough to shape an entire life. Now those questions were gone. In their place remained something quieter. Peace. Caleb carefully closed the journal. Neither he nor Eleanor noticed that Ranger had moved deeper into the alcove until the dog gently nudged something hidden behind the chest. Caleb reached behind it and discovered one final envelope. The paper was addressed in Thomas's handwriting. To whoever finds this, please return the records and tell the family their story was never forgotten. Caleb smiled softly. Sounds like he completed his mission after all. Eleanor looked toward the dark ocean beyond the cliff. The clouds were beginning to break. A narrow beam of late afternoon sunlight slipped through and painted the water in gold. For the first time in 32 years, she did not feel like someone waiting for answers. She felt like someone who had finally come home. The rain never fully arrived. Instead, the storm drifted north along the coastline, leaving behind a sky washed clean by wind and fading light. Eleanor, Caleb, and Ranger made their way back toward the cabin as the afternoon slowly surrendered to evening. The ocean below reflected ribbons of gold and silver where sunlight broke through the clouds. Every step felt different now. The trail had not changed, yet the burden Eleanor carried for more than 30 years seemed lighter with each passing yard. Back inside the cabin, Caleb carefully organized the journals, letters, photographs, and family records. Arrangements would be made. The documents would reach the people they belonged to. The story Thomas had protected would finally be completed. But for Eleanor, something even more important had already happened. She sat quietly beside the old fireplace while Ranger rested at her feet. The German shepherd's head lay across her boots, his amber eyes half closed, peaceful at last. Eleanor gently slipped Thomas's wedding ring onto the chain around her neck and held it there for a moment, not as someone clinging to the past, as someone grateful for it. The cabin felt different now, less like a place abandoned by time and more like a promise kept. Caleb eventually stepped outside to make a call from a ridge where reception was stronger. That left Eleanor alone with Ranger and the fading daylight. Silence settled softly around them, not the lonely silence she had known for years. A comforting one, the kind that arrives when questions no longer demand answers. Her gaze drifted toward the window overlooking the sea. She remembered the young Marine she had married. She remembered long drives along the coast, simple dinners, laughter beside campfires, and dreams that once seemed too large for two ordinary people. Time had taken many things, yet somehow it had failed to erase what mattered most. Love had survived. Faith had survived. Truth had survived. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and walked toward the doorway. Eleanor followed him onto the porch. The evening sky glowed with shades of amber and soft blue. Far out on the horizon, sunlight illuminated a single stretch of water that shimmered like polished glass. Ranger sat beside her and stared toward the ocean. Eleanor lowered herself carefully onto the top step. For several minutes, neither moved. The wind carried the scent of cedar and salt. Gulls drifted lazily overhead. Somewhere below, waves met the shoreline with patient rhythm. Eleanor smiled through tears she no longer tried to hide. "We found him, boy," she whispered. Ranger leaned gently against her side. The simple gesture said more than words ever could. They had not found a lost man. They had found the truth he left behind. As the last light of day settled across the cliffs, Eleanor felt something she had not felt in many years. Not sadness, not regret. Grace, the quiet kind that arrives without announcement. The kind that asks for nothing except gratitude. Behind her, the cabin stood watch over the ocean just as it always had. Ahead, the horizon stretched endlessly beneath a peaceful sky. And there on the edge of the world, beside a faithful dog and surrounded by the echoes of a life well lived, Eleanor finally understood that some stories do not end when people disappear. Sometimes they wait patiently for the right heart, the right moment, and the right pair of paws to lead the way home.